I end up, given the constraints of time, talking to about 50 people, which is what I did for the riots. All sorts of people, police who were in charge of organising the response, plus police officers who were actually on the ground trying to counter the riots, people who were in Tottenham when the riot had broken up, rioters, although those were difficult to find, and politicians. And I ended up with a real knowledge, a real sort of understanding of what had happened in 2011. Not just that, and also an understanding of how a riot can break out and what can go wrong to allow it to spread. But of course, I can't use all that on the stage. I interview 50 people. I can only have maximum 13 actors acting different roles, otherwise it's too expensive, and the audience won't understand who anybody is. So I end up, I mean, that's one of the pleasure of doing a verbatim play, knowing a lot more than I can put on the stage. I have to decide in the end, of all the things I've learned, what will be most interesting and most coherent to an audience that I'm trying to speak to. But I know more about it. And when I thought about writing 10 Days, whose ambition was to talk a bit about this London that we live in, where we all take public transport together, we don't necessarily look that dissimilar from each other, we look like we're living the same kind of lives, and we are not living the same kind of lives, depending on our income, our education, our background, our opportunity. We're all living very different lives. And that's what, in a way, I wanted to write about in 10 Days. I wanted to write about, I think because I come from such a political family, I'm very aware of how big politics out there impact on individual lives, on how it may look as if nothing that's happening out there has anything to do with us, but effectively we are being absolutely affected by what's happening in big politics. And so I wanted to write about that, and I thought about my play The Riots, and I decided that I would start the book on a riot, that I would kick off my plot about a riot, because I think rioting and the responses to riots exposes a lot of the position of those people who are responding to it. You know, my experience of talking to people on the ground in Tottenham, compared to the police who were policing it, compared to the politicians who were making pronouncements about it, was that depending what their relationship to the riot was, where they were when it broke out, they said completely different things about it, and they had completely different understandings about it. So I thought that was a good way of talking about what I wanted to talk about is similarities and differences in all our lives, and how what one person does may not have the effect that they think it will on another person, but that the interrelationship means that their effects ricochet between different people in this city and in this country. This book that I wrote, because it's a thriller, and because it was written over 10 days, and because I hadn't actually written a thriller for some time, or a plot-driven novel, I didn't feel completely confident that I could pull it off in the beginning. So I plotted this book out much more than I have plotted out the 5 books before then. So for me, there isn't an answer. It's different for every book I write.
Your childhood sounds extraordinary. Have you ever, forgive my ignorance, I don't know, have you ever used that as a subject matter for one of your novels or featured it?
I haven't used my childhood for one of my novels. I've written a family memoir. It's the only piece of non-fiction that I've written. So I wrote a book called Every Secret Thing, which is about my childhood, but also about my family and the kind of things that they did. And I also recently, because I was part of an Art Angel exhibition in Reading Prison, I don't know if you've heard about it. It's rather wonderful. If you have time, go and see it. They've taken over Reading Prison, put all sorts of artworks there, but the prison itself, which is now empty and unused, is part of the exhibition. And I help them write. I co-curated the section of that which is about writers imagining writing from prison to a loved one. And I wrote one of the letters, and being a writer, I broke the rules. Since I was commissioning people to write from prison to a loved one, I actually decided to instead write a letter to my mother, who was in prison in South Africa, in solitary detention, and as a result, what had been done to her, tried to kill herself while she was in prison, although thankfully she didn't succeed. So I wrote a letter to her about that. If you want to hear it, it's on Radio 4 at 7:45 on Wednesday, I think. It's on. So that I've written those, but it has informed everything I write, actually. I mean, the book that I told you about, Red Dust, which is set in South Africa, is about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission coming to a town in the middle of nowhere, again, that I made up, and trying to deal with the past. And one of the reasons I wrote that is my experiences with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because my mother in 1982 was killed by the South African police, and when the first democratic election happened, they, two ex-policemen applied for amnesty for her murder. So although Red Dust is nothing about her and not about that, its inspiration comes from my experience there. Oh, now I've made everybody look very grim. Yeah.
Sorry.
Light and airy.
I've actually got two questions. The first one is not to be, I'll ask anyway. Are you related to Joe, by any chance?
Sorry?
Are you related to Joe Slovo?
Yeah, I'm one of his daughters.
Okay. Oh, you're Joe's daughter? Okay,
Yeah.
welcome. He's a hero.
And of mine, actually.
Great to meet you. The other thing is, and I've talked to authors about this in the past, I certainly find it to be the case of being dyslexic and find it really difficult to read. Certain authors seem to have a rhythm that makes their writing very, very easy to read for me. Certain books I can skim through incredibly quickly. But it's always, I might come to some sort of this, certain authors have a rhythm that make reading much easier. Certain books are much of a struggle. Is that something that rings true with you, or is it just something that's some peculiar to me?
I'd be interested to know from you what the rhythm is that makes it easier, but I tell you, when I'm writing, I'm very conscious of how things sound. And if I write a sentence that in my head doesn't sound right, doesn't flow in a way that makes sense to me, I change it. And I think that most of the writing I like also has a rhythm that works. That somehow the author is making it so that the sentences are well gelled together and the words are well gelled into a sentence. So I suppose for me, that's what good writing is. And often for me, the writing I like best is the simplest. And I don't think it's easy to write simply, especially if you put in complex ideas or complex characters in. You really have to work to make something look easy to read. So maybe you're just talking about the best writers, the ones that manage to work so that they speak to you in a way that feels natural to what you're reading.
When you're writing verbatim plays, it must present its own challenges. I know when you were writing, was it Another World? That's one of the examples that the Brussels and the Paris occurred in the middle of your research, and you went back and re-interviewed people. I mean, is that the excitement, or is that made it sort of difficult for you?
What she's talking about is Another World was a verbatim play that I made on Islamic State and why our kids go. It is true. All these these verbatim plays that I do be very, very topical. And the danger of writing something as topical as that is things can change while you're writing it. And one of the reasons why that play worked was that we had interviewed a number of women in Brussels who children had gone to join Islamic State. Many of these mothers had lost their children. I mean, they'd either lost them to death or they had just lost them because psychologically they had lost them. Their children had sort of joined this death cult and, you know, become very alien to them. And while I was writing it, things were moving very fast, including the fact that, for example, Islamic State territory was changing. Things were happening in Syria with what was happening in the war. So I had one expert who was very, very good at giving me, you know, sentences. He understood what I was trying to do, and I would write to him. I would ring him up and say, look, Palmyra has been reoccupied by Assad. Does that mean Islamic State's on the wane? And he would give, and he was very good at his subject, very crucial to the play actually. And he would give me sort of a soundbite of how to make it so that the play wouldn't seem, even before it had come out, to be old-fashioned, to be not with the news. But the serious thing that really happened while we were doing it is we had interviewed these mother, all of whom didn't really know where their children were exactly. And when we were researching the play, we found out that one of the mothers we interviewed, her son had been part of the Paris attacks and had gone to Paris and had blown himself out outside the stadium. He hadn't killed anybody, but presumably he was trying to kill people. And that was a moment when we really had to think, how are we going to deal with this? And what we did in the end was put a statement on the end that the actor who had played this mother then took off her hijab and said what had happened, that while we were rehearsing this we had discovered this, and this is what he had done, because it didn't feel right not to have that statement there for the audience, but it also didn't feel right to take that mother out just because of that, because nobody ever said that these children who'd gone to the Islamic State wouldn't end up doing something horrendous, because that is what they had joined. And for me, actually, it gave the play much more poignancy, because when I looked again at what that mother had said, and how, even before we had known this, and even before she had known this, she had talked about her own responsibility for not being able to stop him. I think it made the play sort of more interesting, but also more accurate about what is happening out there in Europe.
Okay, thank you.
So my first, how did you make the transition from book writing to playwriting, or both playwriting? Was it easy as well?
Well, it's never easy to. Every time I'm about to write a book, I think I can't do it. So yeah, when I started writing a verbatim play, I thought I can't do it. But actually, one of the things that really helped me with those plays was, one, my novelist's interest in people, which means that I love doing the interviews because I do want to find out. That's why I'm a novelist partly. I want to find out what people are thinking and why they're thinking it. And for a verbatim play, you actually go and ask them. But the other thing was my experience of writing crime, because it does really help you with structure. If you can write a crime novel, you know how to structure something, and a lot of the challenge of a verbatim play was to corral all these different impressions and thoughts and understandings into a form that will allow an audience to sort of have a journey through this subject. And the fact that I have done crime, that I know how to organise a plot, I think is very helpful. And I'm interested in story. I mean, I'm a reader who's interested in story. I like a story. I want to be able to, I like my books to be well written. But I also like them to, I want to be pulled through. And so that is what I've worked on as a novelist, and helps with plays. So I think what I'll do is I will read you a little section from each of these characters and then open up for questions, conversations. And I'm going to start with Peter Whiteley, the Home Secretary. This is day 1 and this is 4:35 in the morning and Peter's up. When Peter came out of the house, one of the 2 waiting officers spoke softly into his radio while the other moved aside to let him pass. He opened the gate at the end of the path and let Patsy bounce through, even though this was against the rules, Patsy's therapist having apparently decided that Patsy took Charles's absences in school to mean that he was a discard and she the favoured child, which is why she kept trying to find Charles when he came home. So now apparently they had to re-educate the dog into knowing her place in the family hierarchy, which meant never letting her lead the way. Dog therapist. He might have said the words out loud, although the officers did not react. They were good. This current team of SO1 Specialist Protection Branch, adept at keeping a low profile. He could hear them, a few steps back, their regular padding, companionable sound in the soft, dark night, while Patsy sniffed the ground. There was no light from any of the houses that stood back behind front gardens, just the shadow of trees that lined this gracious street. Walking here, he felt a sense of belonging and, yes, he was not ashamed to admit it, of comfort, especially when compared to the streets on which he had been dragged up. Despite his irritation about this enforced walk, he did enjoy the quiet of the empty mornings. To move, for once, unbothered by what other people saw and thought and said, this was insomnia's reward. Not that it was the smoothest of walks. The dog, having been fed, reverted to her usual irritating habit, he doesn't like this dog, of setting off at such a brisk pace that she pulled him along. Luckily there was nobody about to see, or worse, see a picture of him, until he grew accustomed to her pace, at which point she slowed right down so she could sniff at each and every tree they passed. She must have sensed that he was in a hurry. The dog doesn't like him either. Because now she really took her time. They were halfway down the next block before she made her choice. She stopped and squatted. He looked away, another of the bloody psychologist's instructions, while she did her business, and then, feeling a tug on the lead, reached into his pocket. Damn, he'd forgotten to bring a bag. He couldn't leave the pavement found, he'd have to go back. He glanced in irritation at his watch. Here you are, sir. Thank you. He took the outstretched bag, wondering as he did what Joshua Yard, such a stickler for the rules, would think of that. He scooped up the dog mess and, holding it at arm's length, turned, "Your commissioner's first day." The officers nodded, all 3 of them simultaneously, although none of them smiled. They didn't like Yars any more than he did. So this is 5:15 a.m. and this is Yars. 45 minutes to the second, and the new Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Joshua Yars, was back at his front door. He was sweating hard, and better still, had run out of his mind the worries that beset him before the start of any task. No matter that he had landed the big one, chief of the Met, he was not going to spend energy worrying about the way they'd got rid of his predecessor, or about the extent of the mess they were expecting him to clear up. Far better to begin with a clear head and expectations that things would go right. And if they didn't, well, then he would deal with each problem strictly in the order in which it arose. He buffed his trainers against the doormat, watching the dust rise, and then he took them off and strode upstairs to shower fast as he did everything, while still taking care to systematically wash and dry himself. And now the moment that had been so long in its anticipation. He put on a gleaming pair of white briefs that he had removed from their packaging the night before, then the socks, black and new as well, and a crisp white shirt. He ironed it twice to make sure, and after that the black trousers that he had had specially fitted to suit his athletic frame. He knotted the black tie by setting marginally off kilter, redid the knot before fitting it snugly but not too tightly under his collar. And finally, two items that set the seal on his newfound status, his tunic and his cap. The black tunic, also specially fitted, with its gorget patches and ceremonial aiguillettes that passed from the pocket to the top button, sat nicely across his broad shoulders. He fastened the buttons, starting from the bottom and ending at the point parallel with his jacket, with a black and grey stripe of his Queen's medal, and the red, blue and white bars of the two jubilees were lined up. Such a pleasure to see them there, especially since he had every expectation that coming next New Year they would be trumped by the yellow and brown of a cane. He squeezed his jacket down. It looked clean and pressed and right. And finally, not that he needed it just then, his cap. This, with the crown above the brass star and its wreath-enclosed tipstaves and the oak leaves that ran along the inner and outer edges of the peak, would tell even the most casual onlooker he was the senior policeman in the land. He placed it carefully, using the mirror to make sure that the peaker sat along the line of his forehead. He closed his eyes, felt along the cap, and then, eyes still closed, took it off, breathed in and out before putting it back. Eyes open. It was perfectly aligned. Now he'd be able to do it like this every time, even in a hurry. He took off the cap and was about to make his way downstairs when something else occurred. Yeah, why not? He went over to the wall behind his bed and, leaning across, lifted off the framed photograph that, taken on the occasion of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, had him beside the Queen. It would go nicely in his new office. With photograph and cap in hand, he made his way downstairs. 5:25. He clicked on the radio and remained standing as he ate his usual breakfast, 2 slices of wholemeal toast, both with marmalade and a percolated coffee, to which he added just the tiniest dash of milk. He was just putting his plate in the dishwasher when the item he'd been half expecting came on the radio. Today, he heard, is the new Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Joshua Yar's first day. He straightened up and smiled. To give the background to the appointment, the radio announcer continued, which saw the Prime Minister and Home Secretary involved in a public spat, we go to our Home Affairs correspondent. And finally, I'm just going to read a bit from my third character, who's Kathy Mason. And I think what you need to know is this is a London. This whole thing is set in a London, which is really heating up. And the temperatures have been rising. It's far too early in the summer for this to be happening. So this is 6 a.m. It's 6 o'clock, the radio announcer said, and as the countdown for next year election begins, the heat wave continues. As if anybody needs to be told that the temperature and humidity were breaking all records and had been for weeks, Kathy flung herself across the bed, banging on the radio to cut it off. She was boiling. Picking up the sheet she had thrown to the floor, she wrapped it round herself and went over to the window, just as she thought the bloody radiator was on. Those bastards in the housing department, apologies to any councillors here, they'd promised they'd solve the problem. The way they talked had led her to believe they had already solved the problem. But for the fifth day in a row, the central boiler, which barely functioned in winter, had switched on the whole estate at 5. The crazy logic of a council too mean to hire a proper engineer to fix the glitch, but prepared to pay the enormous electricity bills that would fall to them when the Lovelace came down. It's like a microcosm for the world, she thought, burning before final destruction. She moved into the lounge. With its heaters blaring, this room was also unbearably hot. Maybe Lyndall, his daughter, was right. Maybe they should cut their losses and move before the estate agreed its loss. The bedroom had to be cooler than this. She made her way back, and having opened the curtains, settled herself on top of the bed. And there she lay, letting her thoughts drift as she watched the night edged out by a bloodied dawn that washed the dirty white walls with pink. Soon after, bands of crimson and purple and deep dark red began to streak the sky in defiance of the rising sun. Such a ferocious sight, red sky in the morning, an omen. For days now, she'd had a feeling of something not being right. It wasn't just Banji's recent reappearance. Banji is her boyfriend, who she knew some time ago he disappeared and he's come back again. Or the impending closure of the estate. It was a feeling that something awful was about to happen. To her, to Lyndall, or to somebody they knew, Banji perhaps. She seemed to see again that vision of him, warped by the helicopter, and then the lonely slope of his back as he had walked away. She should have kept him with her, should not have let him go. A crazy thought. She couldn't have stopped him, never could. It's the heat, she thought. It's playing with my mind. Except this was not the first time that a similar foreboding had gripped her. She'd felt it just before her father had died, for example, or when, no, she would not think of it. She reached out and switched on the radio. It's 6:15, she heard, and the temperature in London continues to climb. That's it. I wrote a book about General Gordon, who went in the 1880s to Khartoum to fight a jihad and ended up having his head cut off. I wrote about a group, a family who came, what was originally Ceylon, and came to London in the 1950s. What I didn't do was write about the England that I had grown to know. And I think in the beginning why I didn't write about it is because I still felt myself partly to be a foreigner. Although I have been to secondary school here, to university, I've spent all my adult life here. I think there is something about moving countries where you don't necessarily feel that you completely understand the society because you didn't go to primary school. You didn't grow up as a young child in this. So, for example, it took me a long time to appreciate the beauty of the English countryside. I never wrote a diary when I was a kid. I never dreamt that I would want to write. On the contrary, I had a mother who was a journalist, and I definitely thought that I wasn't going to do what she was going to do. And I went to university, I studied science subjects, I did science A-levels. I never thought I would write. And then I did my first job, which is I was a research assistant to somebody who was writing a book about science and society, except he wasn't writing the book, and I wasn't doing the research. And that took me some time. At the end of 3 years, I decided it was just too boring for words and I was going to leave my job. And that was a time when you could leave a job and know that you were going to get another one. And I also had a bit of pension from my 3 years, which I cashed in, probably a mistake. And I decided to spend some time trying to work out what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I had a friend who was an academic who was on a sabbatical, and we were talking one day about the fact that we liked reading the same kind of things, and what we liked reading was crime, but crime which were the hard-boiled detectives of America, the Chandler and Hammonds, you know, the Philip Morrow who walked the mean streets of America. And when we were talking about this, we talked about the fact of how difficult would it be to modernize this, because those were written in the 30s and 40s, put them into the world we were and into the cities that we knew. because at that point, a lot of crime in England was in the country house and not in the cities. And we decided, just as a way of occupying ourselves, to each start a detective novel, to meet once a week to discuss where we got to, read each other's things, drink a lot of beer in order to keep ourselves going, and see where we got. And I discovered I really liked doing it. I really liked writing fiction. I had written some non-fiction before, but it just didn't do the same for me. I really liked creating the world. And although my friend went back to his job in the end, I finished the book, and then I sent it around to publishers and was lucky enough to get a publisher, because there is some luck involved in getting published for the first time, particularly these days actually. It was bad then and it's worse now. And what I wrote was crime. I created a detective called Kate Bayer who walked the mean streets of the place where I was living, which was in Hackney, in Dalston. And I wrote about the world in a way that I occupied. And I wrote 3 detective novels with Kate, and then I did something else in between, and then I wrote another 2. So in all, I wrote 5 crime novels with Kate, and I learned a lot about writing from doing this. I learned, and that relates to 10 Days, about plotting, about what you have to do with plot. And when I think about why it is that I first wrote crime rather than anything else, I think there are a number of reasons. One of them was that that's what I read at the time, and therefore it was natural for me to want to write within that genre. Another was, I think, because I hadn't come from any English literature background, it felt very ambitious for me to want to do a book, and it felt very scary, and I didn't know quite how you wrote a novel. I read them, but I didn't know how you went about writing them, and I thought that if I wrote with a plot, with a crime novel where the plot needs to pull you through, that would make it easier for me. That the story would be carried through on the plot, and therefore I would have some rules that I would have to keep to that I kind of understood intuitively. One of the things I think in hindsight about that is there was another reason why I ended up writing crime, and in particular a detective novel, which was because I came from South Africa. I came to England when I was 12 years old. Before I came to England, my parents were 2 of the very few white people in South Africa who refused to close their eyes to what was happening there, and who joined the resistance against apartheid. And as a result, through my childhood was dotted by their arrests, their imprisonments, their disappearance, because practically everything they did, which they really felt passionately about, was illegal in that time, including, it has to be said, the parties that they threw. So I grew up thinking that when I grew up, when you had a party, you'd have a righteous party, everybody would get thoroughly drunk. Towards the middle of the end of the party, there'd be a huge bang on the door, police would come in, and everybody would throw what's left in their glasses into the vases that my mother kept around the house. And only later did I realize that isn't what normal adults did. The reason they were doing that was because it was actually illegal for black and white people to drink alcohol together. So as soon as the police arrived, they'd throw their alcohol out and everybody would be standing there with an empty glass. That was the funny part of being that child. There was a more serious part, which was about the fact that there was a feeling of danger all the time. And when my parents wanted to talk about something that interested them, and it was usually politics and what they were doing, instead of talking about it in front of us and in the house, they'd get up and go into the garden and talk about it, because so that somebody shouldn't overhear them. And there was a feeling as their child that things could go wrong very easily, and that I wouldn't understand why they were going wrong. So I learned to be a very good an eavesdropper in order to understand what was happening, to make myself feel safe by sort of being pre-warned about what was happening. And of course, when I wrote crime novels and detective novels, I realised that's what a detective does. A detective, especially in fiction, is the person who is trying to find out what everybody else is trying to stop her from finding out. And that is partly, I think, why this genre spoke to me. I wrote, as I said, 5 of the novels. I learned a lot about writing doing it. When I started, because I wanted to modernise the detective genre, I wanted to have a detective who could walk the mean streets like Chandler's Marlowe, but who wasn't such a Superman like Chandler's Marlowe, who wouldn't, you know, go out into the streets, get biffed on the head, and the next day be up and continuing, or get betrayed by a woman and the next day be up and continuing. I wanted to have a real woman. I wanted to have a woman who had contact and life and the ability to have relationships. So I gave my Kate Baer a partner, and also he came with a stepson, and I gave her also 2 friends. That worked just about fine in my first novel, but I soon realised the reason why Marlowe has no friends, and most crime detectives, novel detectives, have no friends, is they do get in the way of the plot. You know, you can't be meeting your partner or your friends to have a slug of whiskey or a cup of tea in the middle of trying to solve a plot. So the second novel, I sent the friends to America, and that got rid of them. And then, of course, it was a crime novel. I killed the partner, and that got rid of him. As I said, I wrote 5 of these, and one of the interesting things I think about a writing life is that you learn that the things that made you do something or not do something that applied one year don't necessarily apply 5 books down the line or the next year. And in my case, the very fact that I had wanted to write crime because it had such constraints and such rules began to get on my nerves. Those very rules and constraints began to get on my nerves. And in particular, what began to really affect me was the fact that crime novels are all about death, mayhem, disaster, but they're not about loss or grief or feelings in that way, because the plot gets in the way. And I think by about novel 4, or maybe 5, I managed with 5 as well, that began to prevent me from exploring my ambitions as a novelist. I wanted to go more into feelings. So I said goodbye to Kate Baer, and I went and wrote a whole series of other novels that were very different, which allowed me to explore not so much plot, but more character. And I mean, I think it was quite interesting that when I started, I had my Kate Baer in the inner London that I knew, but after I left her, I went everywhere around the world, avoiding England. And if I wrote about England, it was 19th century England that I wrote about.